Um, Hello, everyone. My name's Hayden. I am a member of the New Zealand Federation of Social Societies. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. I know you're all here for the same reason I am, to hear the lovely Derrick Varn give us a bit of background history and, speak about the ghosts of the millennial left. But just, yeah, like a bit of housekeeping, as you would have heard, we are recording this event, so it's going to be put up on our YouTube page, New Zealand Federation of Social Societies. And we'll probably post it on Facebook as well. So if you are not comfortable with that, you can either leave if you like. I suggest not, just turn your camera off, you should be all right. Outside of that, that's the main housekeeping. And yeah, so broadly speaking, right, we are the Federation, New Zealand Federation of Social Societies. We formed in 2021, I think, but the background of it is the Canterbury Social Society was the first affiliation to form in 2017 by a small group of like-minded people who found themselves discussing politics over pints fairly regularly, something we encourage, maybe to our detriment, for good and for ill. For those humble beginnings, the society has steadily grown to one of the largest single branches of the Federation, but Wellington's not too far behind. We also have an Otago branch as well. It was founded on the simple socialist principle the society is aimed to be a political home for the people with a variety of views, rather than attempting to build unity around litigation on the nature of specific revolutionary periods or state experiments, or equally niche interpretations of socialist doctrine. We instead come together around a common vision of socialism. By socialism, we mean, in the broader sense, the political goal of bringing the working class to power at all levels of society in order to establish a system where production is organized to meet human need rather than to pursue the accumulation of private wealth. To this end, we host seminars, lectures, workshops, film screenings, and social events that are open to the public. Additionally, we have members-only events that may be social, political, or organizational in scope. Governance of the society is guided by our constitution, and we aim to be a highly transparent organization with information readily available to our members on our finances, membership numbers, and so on. While primarily we focus on educational events, we also take the initiative to intervene politically where possible and appropriate on issues of concerns for the working class. We currently hold public events across the country. Wellington and Canterbury are probably the most active, doing monthly. Otago picking up a bit of momentum as well. And we do public drinks as well. Canterbury do public drinks once a month. Wellington do public drinks once a month. And Otago, not as regularly. And we also host online seminars. But that's us. That's the Federation.
Once a month.
Like once a month. Once a month. All right. There we have it, from the horse's mouth, once a month. And yeah, we've got an Otago branch, a Wellington branch, a Canterbury branch. Canterbury, for the time being, is the mothership. But you can find us all on Canterbury or Wellington or Otago social societies at gmail.com. Obviously, everything's on Facebook, Instagram, all the social media bits and bobs. Yeah, so if you're interested, people on the call now, or if you're not a member, people who are watching this in the future on YouTube, by all means do reach out. We're easily contactable. But other than that, that's everything to say about the Federation. I'll give a quick introduction of our guest today, Mr. C. Derrick Varn. He is an educator. He's a poet. He is very prevalent online for the left, for good and for worse for his psychic health, I think. One of the original left book individuals, again, probably less good for his mental health, but I will pass things on. And if I've missed anything, Derrick, I'll just try to be brief there, but by all means, take it away.
Yeah, I'm Derrick Varn. I'm the host of Varn Vlog. I've had a long and prodigious history in left-wing media, which is pretty astounding considering that I've pissed off most factions in the United States at one point or the other, and have personally pre-blacklisted myself from a lot of socialist publications. So I'm probably the worst person to talk to in a lot of ways.
That makes you the best, mate.
I am here to talk about the current tendency in the American left in particular, and also to a lesser degree in the British left. So we can talk about the broadly transatlantic and the other direction from you guys. Um, I guess you guys are specific, but the transatlantic left. And one of the things that's interesting about the current moment is the fact that we feel the need to already do an autopsy for the millennial left in America. Um, I always tell people that when we talk about generational cohorts in the United States, we have to be pretty careful about it because um, there is a sense where generation is a material condition that we don't often think about, particularly in the US due to the accumulation of wealth. The baby boomers were literally born into what effectively was the richest society that had ever existed on the planet. Um, and they came to age during a time period where America literally controlled 48% of the world's wealth after World War II. They came to age at the end of a period of Fordism. And our entire political infrastructure was actually altered to accommodate the number of children they brought in. Our public school system, as we now know it, was really built during this time period and codified during this time period. The debates around the public school system were codified during this time period, etc. Now, to mention baby boomers is to say the reason why the millennial cohort is a generation in a coherent sense is we are the baby boomers' literal children. My mother's a baby boomer. Uh, the and our conditions are interestingly almost reversed from the baby boomers. We were born into a period of relative wealth decline in the United States, a period of inflation that rivaled only the 70s in its extensiveness. Um, Although for the first portion of our lives, it was pretty well controlled at about 3%, where the social institutions created for the baby boomers seemed exhausted, and where the political narratives seemed largely to repeat, although in some ways in reverse, the narratives of the new left, etc. Now, I say the new left and the baby boomers because the new left was not actually primarily baby boomers in origin. It mostly came from a generation of communists who were really properly speaking part of the so-called silent generation cohort, are the people who were alive during World War II, but were too young to serve. And were also too old to serve for the most part in Vietnam. A lot of them did serve in North Korea, though, and they actually tended to be, despite mythology and American media today, more anti-war than their slightly younger cohorts until the younger cohorts got drafted. So this really was the foundation of the new left. In a way, to understand the American left today, you really do have to understand how it, in a very strange and particular way, mirrors like a ghost the new left, but is also radically different from it because of the completely different conditions of the United States. And this duality is hard for a lot of people to recognize. It is often manifested in the transatlantic left, and I think this is also true in Britain, as a sort of slow cancellation of the future, as Bifo used to say. But I've never really bought that narrative because I've never really thought that. I actually think weirdly the slow cancellation of the future was oddly optimistic about capitalism, and about what the prior left had done. So to understand that, we kind of have to periodize the new left, which is rarely done. And I kind of periodize the new left in three waves. There's the first wave of people who were not caught up in the Red Scare, are the kind of Red Scare adjacent institutions like the Congress of Cultural Freedom in the United States. For those of you who don't know what the Congress of Cultural Freedom is, it was a OSS/CIA led institution to influence Europe, which tied in a bunch of, quote, left wing academics, Marxist and former Marxists, often encouraged him to take anti Soviet positions. The Frankfurt School wrote for it, Sidney Hook wrote for it, a lot of former Marxists who were Marxists in the 30s and 40s wrote for it, and this was their way into the right wing. A lot of Black intellectuals and key figures of the Black Power movement that broke with the CPUSA were tied up into the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And then there was just the outright blacklisting and harassment of the Red Scare, the second Red Scare. I'm going to go ahead and admit I don't think the second Red Scare is actually the second Red Scare. I think it's more like the fifth. We started having Red Scares in the United States as early as 1880. But nonetheless, it's the big one. And during this time period, for example, the Communist Party of America, for a variety of reasons, went from its high point of about 85,000 people in 1948 to about 10,000 people by 1959. Massive decline. The remaining 10,000 started fracturing around the 1950s in what was beginning to look like the beginnings of the Sino-Soviet split. And so you started seeing new formations break up. Those two things together, plus the geographical concentration of the Communist Party in the United States, which by the end of World War II was disproportionately located, survey says, in the most predictable way one might think, in New York and California. For those of you who have your image of America, you usually think of New York, California, and the backwater. Well, New York and California is where the Communist Party was after the Popular Front. The Red Scare was particularly intense in these areas. A lot of these people renounced their communist affiliations, or some of them went to prison, some of them were blacklisted, some fled to Europe. Interestingly, and kind of surprisingly, in the Midwest, this persecution of communists was actually pursued less vigorously than on the coast. So there was a rump of Midwestern universities which still had communist sympathetic liberals. Think of C. Wright Mills and a lot of the more left-wing ends of the sociology department. When the New Left began, it was these people who really kind of led it. So they weren't Marxist, but they weren't hostile to Marxism, and they were not given to anti-communism. They often worked with the civil rights movement and more liberal institutions, as well as the few remaining kind of popular front figures like Carl Robeson, people like that, who were key to the US left. And they also were willing to work with Trotskyists because they had no sectarian affiliation. This was really the core group of people who became the first round of the New Left. And these are people who were intellectually active between, say, 1959 and the late 1970s, but had their careers established mostly as academics by the early 1960s. You can think of people like Staunton Lynn, C. Wright Mills himself, Howard Zinn, a latecomer to this, but that group of people, Chomsky, another one. So this coterie was really kind of the base of where the activist left was coming from in dialogue and tension with the Democratic Party. We kind of forget that the Kennedy administration was in a particularly weird time. I mean, you could think about someone like Lorraine Hansberry, the Black poet who was a member of the CPUSA, having meetings with Robert Kennedy during the John Kennedy administration, while the Kennedys were also pursuing very strict anti-communism and kind of doubling down on the Eisenhower doctrines of the time. So this is a very contradictory period in American history. The CPUSA's both suppression during the Red Scare and its old age. The CPUSA tended to be about 10 years older than this new coterie of academics. A lot of them have been radicalized during World War II. They fought in the war. They were, quote, greatest generation in our stupid generational cohort namings. Uh, greatest generation is always funny to me. I'm like you're gonna call yourself that. That's a pretty big narrative. But nonetheless, these people, the CPUSA had very little inroads into these very academic Marxian leftists who, because they also came from institutions that were not considered particularly elite, they were largely left alone in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And they were able to join up with the civil rights movement and actively kind of act as its primary leaders, at least for the white agency of that. And the one thing that makes the American left more complicated is our racial history really is particular to us. Unfortunately, I keep about everyone adopting our racial frameworks, and I'm like, well, that's a bad idea. You don't have our racial problems in our histories, so you probably shouldn't do that. But nonetheless,
We are guilty.
So you might be asking, well, what can we learn about the millennial left through this? Well, what really happened is this is the period that really ties the left to students in a way that is different from the past. In the American radical tradition, even before Marxists really became part of it, yes, a certain kind of highly educated bohemian children of the bourgeoisie, we might call them failed sons today, like were very much the leaders of the movement. That was not new, but there being a concentrated body of students, many of whom did come from working class backgrounds because of the expansion of the GI Bill, that was all new. And it was these people who were sent out to work with the civil rights movement. It was these people who were sent out in the early anti-war protests. It was these people who were trying to create cultural influences to shift the debate within the Democratic Party and the Kennedy administration. It was by historical irony, even, that the Democratic Party became the Popular Front Party for the left. There's two reasons for that. And they're deeper. The obvious one is World War II itself and FDR's allegiance in the Popular Front, the Soviet, and FDR's proto-Fordism or proto-Keynesianism, or what is kind of seen as that. But if you look into the deep history of the U.S. left, this tendency had actually been established in the 19th century. The Populist Party's political candidate, William Jennings Bryan, had liquidated himself and into the Democratic Party. That was not an obvious choice. The Democratic Party in the United States in the 19th century was a pretty reactionary party made mostly of people formerly aligned to the planter class and petite bourgeoisie and Sunbelt industrialists, as opposed to the Republican Party, which was the party the larger bourgeois and industrial development in the Northeast. So when William Jennings Bryan liquidated the Populist Party and tied a proto-workers movement into the Democratic Party at the turn of the century, it was kind of surprising. But that actually set up the groundwork before the Popular Front in the 1930s happened under the FDR. So there's a long tradition here. So we might go, okay, what's haunting us? Well, even before Marxists were a key part of the American left, Marx was, writing for Republican journals. I know that's kind of surprising, but he was writing for like Lincoln's German language newspapers in the United States. A whole lot of Marxist writing was actually published in the U.S., something that people in the U.S. themselves largely don't know. It was published most often in German, sometimes in English, but it was New York newspapers that largely published it, and they were newspapers aligned to the Republican Party. So this fundamental shift after Bryant really moves everything over. Marx is not a big figure in 19th century American left. The big figures are people from France, a homegrown American, radicals who were just from the radical Republican tradition, various kinds of quasi-anarchist, individualist, etc. Suffragettes. There's all kinds of stuff, but socialism, while not unheard of in 19th century America, was not the dominant tradition. The Knights of Labor, our first real working class organization, itself was kind of hostile to even striking, much less socialism. So the party that was closest to socialist ideas actually were the Populist Party, but again, I mentioned they liquidated themselves into the Democratic Party, and I think for two reasons. The Populist Party's base was a mixture of early industrial workers in the United States and sharecroppers. And sharecroppers just went away as a class in America. Like the end of the 19th century saw the liquidation of the sharecropper, for the most part, into the cities and into industrial work. So there just wasn't a class base for that party in the same way. Now, again, you might go, what does this have to do with the millennial left? We jump 100 years into the future and we look at this millennial left that we see today. What was the most recent attempt in America to revitalize, say, the Bernie movement? And the appeal was to the Populist Party and the People's Party, literally to the 19th century sharecropper proto-proletariat left that existed, that became part of the core of the Socialist Party of America and the labor movement, but only part of it. So that's the first stage. What do we see on our end? Well, the millennial left, interestingly, mirrors the baby boomer left in a way that is both similar and yet different. We're going to emphasize this a lot. The left in America in the 1990s was dominated by two dominant ideological positions: anarchism, and a kind of anarchism that's commonly expressed with Chomsky, which was amenable to electoralism and the Popular Front and issues-driven politics, and Trotskyism, but not the American forms of Trotskyism that were born in the 1930s and 40s, but the British forms that came over during the alter globalization movement. Literally, the major Trotskyist parties were either American organizations that had transformed themselves. So the International Socialist Movement, which started out as the Independent Socialist Movement in the United States, went from being driven by the thought of Max Shachtman to being driven by the thought of Tony Cliff, from Britain. So in the 90s, what you saw was a kind of, frankly, non-local Trotskyism filling in the gap for what would have come from either the American Trotskyist movement or the CPUSA, or one of their weird Maoist split-offs. You might go, okay, again, I'm not really seeing the thing here, but the Trotskyism that we got being from Britain was also not standard Trotskyism. It was Cliffite Trotskyism, kind of the Cliffite Trotskyism. I don't know if any of you are Cliffite, so please forgive me. But Cliffite Trotskyism incorporated elements of both right-wing social democracy and ultra-left state capitalist theories. So it's a very weird formation that was very they were very conciliatory for working with the Democratic Party, but they refused to engage in a Popular Front, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they were extremely hostile to any recuperation of the Soviet Union. And in some ways, by the time that they became popular in the United States, amongst I say popular, we're still talking about 5,000-10,000, because that's like the largest socialist groups in the country at the time. They were kind of an odd man out, and they didn't really have a huge set of inputs. The other thing that happened is the old Trotskyist parties and the CPUSA, if they were out of step with the age of their constituency in the 1960s, by the 1990s, they were literally ancient compared to the constituency. I think, like we were talking about, the average age of a CPUSA member being something like 50 in a time period where most of the people who identified on the left were in their 20s. And with the age of the leadership approaching their 80s by this time. So the US left is really dominated by a external the Trotskyist movement and an internal anarchist movement that was not completely hostile to Marxism, but had a current of pretty thorough anti-Soviet, anti-communism going through it. They were also, and I think, responding to, instead of the Red Scare, the obvious collapse of the Soviet Union, which is always the elephant in the room in this scenario. And again, like the OG new leftist, they actually were from a generation prior. Most of them were Gen Xers. Some of them were younger baby boomers. All right. Their politics is really encapsulated by the time period from 1999 in the Battle for Seattle, where this mixture of Trotskyist and like liberal conciliatory quasi-insurrectionary anarchism glommed itself onto the anti/alter globalization movement, and then liquidated itself in Occupy. Occupy in America was as much the death of one left and one period of what was going to be the millennial left, and the birth of another. Even though David Graeber's real fame comes after Occupy, his politics pretty much dies in Occupy. Similarly, let's go back to the New Left again and talk about this as a kind of a ghost. These civil rights Marxian figures like C. Wright Mills and Staunton Lynn, they are influential on the New Left. But when the New Left really enters the SDS, these old socialist formation and these new splits from the CPUSA start to enter the movement. So by the time you get to 1969, 1970, 1971, the leadership of the SDS, and for those of you who don't know, that's Students for a Democratic Society. Those are the people who led like the Berkeley free speech revolts, and they were really big in the anti-war movement. Between the decline of the CPUSA and the growth of the DSA, they were the largest left-wing, although they weren't all socialist, movement in the US. They had about 80,000 members at one point. They also declined rapidly. So between 1968 and 1971, they almost dissolved. But all these break-off sects from the CPUSA entered the milieu, tried to recruit, and then they hit a wall. The wall is two things: the 1968 Democratic Convention and the failure of the protest movement to end the Vietnam War. Now, one of the things that you get in American mythology about itself is that the New Left played a key role in ending the Vietnam War. Bullshit. Nixon ended the war because the North Vietnamese army and the South Vietnamese irregulars defeated the United States Army, and it was broadly unpopular among soldiers there, many of whom did not really attach themselves to the countercultural vision of the New Left. Then what happens next? In the 1970s, you see two things. You see both the culture of narcissism and the birth of the new communist movement. The new communist movement glommed onto national liberation movements of the 60s. They were strongly affiliated, usually with Maoist groups, sometimes from France, sometimes from Latin America. And they were strong defenders of either the PRC or the USSR. There were probably Max Elbaum, the former member and scholar of this period, says that there might have been 1 million of them. I think that's a highly overstated estimation, but it was larger than probably the CPUSA ever was. However, they were broken up over probably 100 to 150 different groups. They are largely politically ineffective. Many of these groups run internal terror campaigns. So there's massive bombing campaigns run by the Weathermen and the Yippies The interesting thing about these terror campaigns is they're not aimed at killing people. So they're actually kind of the only thing they really blow up is they do a ton of property damage and kill a lot of themselves. So this goes on during the 1970s. Um, you also see the Black Power movement kind of divide over whether or not it should be nationalist or Marxist. You see this both out between the Panthers and other Black Power groups, but you also see this within the Panthers themselves. And what happens there is the leadership mainly dies or normalizes. The Black Liberation Army, a lot of those people ended up being Nixonites. It's a very strange time period, but you have a massive liquidation of a lot of these people very quickly. By the 1980s and the ascent of Reagan, we have no one even accounted to where a lot of these people went. A lot of the Maoists just became standard Democrats. You can start finding people who were attached to radical Maoist factions in the 60s and 70s who were normal Democratic politicians like Robert Reich and Gene Kwan in the United States by the 80s and 90s. So a lot of them are just normalized in everyday life. Then there's, like I mentioned, the Gen X gap and the Gen X years, and then this anarchist Trotskyist years. There's hardly any organized left that's anything other than issue driven. Anti-globalization movement, anti-first Iraq war. But there's no real organization to it. There's no institutions built out of it. And most things are very specific and very limited in what their aims are. There is a strange time period in this time period too, where there's a lot of like nascent third parties going on. Peter Camejo's Green Party tries to come up. That doesn't really work. They kind of get wedded to Nader, and then they tie with some weird paleo conservative alliance where they're like working with Pat Buchanan. So there's also like no real principle guidance for the left in this time period. The anti-war movement and the suppression of the war on terror really puts that on halt almost altogether. While there was no mass arrest of leftists, there were anarchists who were arrested and charged with terrorism, usually on trumped up property damage charges. But the left lost its ability to, we were often prevented from protesting, etc. That really was over in the Obama campaign, which sees itself as an anti-establishment campaign. And again, a lot of people who had seen this incoherent third party movement amongst Gen Xers just reject that. They're like, okay, we have to work with the Democratic Party. You see a resurrection after Occupy of the ideas of Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington was I would say, from my perspective, a right-wing social democrat who was concessionary to the Democratic Party, who had been arguing that we needed to have a populism based on something like the People's Party, but within the Democratic Party again. And he was arguing this in the late 1960s, and particularly supported the McGovern campaign, then the Jesse Jackson campaign in the 80s. His ideas were largely seen as discredited by the 90s, but after the failure of Occupy, they come back. Bernie Sanders himself, part of this original movement tied to Harrington personally, major socialist figure in Vermont, criticized by a lot of socialists as well for his developmentalism and his inability to take clear geopolitical stances. An obscure figure and not a popular one. The frustration with Obama, just like the frustration with the Democratic Party in 1968, led again to these old figures, these survivors of the new left, literally becoming the leaders of the millennial left. I mean, it's literally the same people. Just now they're in their 80s and not their 30s. So in this way, to tie this to the theme of hauntology, this has been a lot of history I'm throwing at you guys, but to tie this to the theme of hauntology, you have a set of stages. But what's interesting about the end result of these stages is during the new left, you end in something like anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninism, and you begin in something like anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninism, but they have very different theories, operational practices, and goals. All right. Um, Now today, we didn't start with anti-revisionist Marxist Leninism. We didn't start really anything Marxist, but we see the same ideas, and again, literally the same people, the same books. One of the best-selling Marxist-Leninist books in the aught teens was *Settlers* by Jay Sakai. It was written in the early '80s based off experiences in the '70s. All right, so this new millennial left kept on looking to both critique the new left for failing, but also in this weird way kept doing the same thing and largely has ended up in the same place. We today have a lot of people who engage in what I like to call mythic Marxist Leninism, which is like it's Marxist Leninism of vibes. Ask them what policy they want, or even whether or not we should be supporting what particular states. You get a wide range of answers. Everything from multipolarity to dingism to shining path shows up amongst people who call themselves Marxist-Leninists in the United States. It is popular, I believe, as a differentiation from the Social Democratic Party, from the Social Democratic group, and they were never a party here, in the DSA. However, it is largely based on a kind of inversion of anti-communist myths, and it's very inconsistent. And one of the weirder things about this current round of, we might call it neo-Stalinism or neo-anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninism, more concessionary to what they call themselves, is that they haven't formed institutions or parties. They are largely media movements. You do meet them in real life. They're not only on the internet. That's not true. But they don't have any institutional grip, and they don't have any real ties to actually existing states, which is a very different scenario than either the new communist movement or the old CPUSA or the early Maoist groups. I mean, China was sending the Panthers money. So this is something to look at today. Why do we see this as hauntology? Let's go back to what hauntology is, and then I'm going to let you guys ask questions because it's probably just a ton of history. One of the premises I work from, and I'm kind of critical of Mark Fisher, and maybe you guys can ask more about it. It's not my key point today. But this idea of, if you can't learn from the past, people will sell it to you. In a weird way, ideologies in the United States left today are actually very itemized personal identities. And this has led them to repeat a lot of the recent past. But they're not, like, when people try to repeat certain leftist movements in the United States from the past, they don't go very far past. You usually stop somewhere around maybe the 1940s. The U.S. left is probably just as ignorant of its history as any Kiwi is of the U.S. left's history, and probably why you're ignorant of our history, because we don't write about it either. If you were to believe most people in the U.S., there was the good period during the 30s. There's the bad period from the 50s. And then there's the renegade kind of off-kilter period of the new left. And then there's nothing again until 2007. That's a kind of mythic framework, but it's one that a lot of people believe. One of the reasons why I brought that deep generational history stuff in the beginning is that what you see in the development of the US left is actually, there's even repetitions of things most leftists barely know anything about. Like, if you ask people what they know about the Popular Party or the People's Party, they're like, it's a time where the little guy fought, the big guy, and the 99% versus the 1%, they were probably socialists. That's all they know. Like, they don't know the class base, they don't know the monetary concerns, they don't know where they were particularly powerful. They don't really understand that it was the People's Party or the Populist Party that liquidated and tied the left to the Democratic Party in the first place, even before the Popular Front did in the late 1930s, 1940s. And so these things come back as like a trace of history. Like, the American left doesn't really know its history, And it doesn't really know how to deal with the fact that it keeps on doing what it's critiquing. Like if you look at the left after Occupy, the quote dirtbag phase of the millennial left, and I'm using American terms, and we can all mock them quietly. You can talk about how the Yanks are stupid. I totally agree with you. But what did they begin to do? They started as critiquing an allegiance to the Democratic Party. What did they do? They entered the Democratic Party in mass, and in fact, gave it a sense of growth and optimism that it hadn't had since Obama. Itself, a kind of outsider insider strategy that if people were paying attention, they would have seen immediately that Obama was not a negation of the Clinton legacy and of the Atari Democrats, of the DNC, which is what you probably know them as. It was a crowning of them because he put the most conservative elements of the Clinton policy apparatus in his own cabinet immediately. So, and this was not recognized. People recognized it later. They recognized it by 2013, 2014, but they didn't recognize it at the time. And again, we'd seen this before. This had happened before. I mean, in a very real sense, the Kennedy administration had pulled from a lot of the more conservative elements of the younger end of the New Deal, and of even the Eisenhower administration. And that was the beginning of this whole continuity in the administrative state. Really starts, but with the transition from the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration. And again, most people in the millennial left don't know this. So they seem haunted by what they don't know. And even though they often start out to critique it, because they don't understand the larger systemic structures of which they were operating it, they largely recapitulate the same mistakes, but in a different way and in a weirder way today. There's a lot of talk about how these anti-Israeli occupation and calls for Gaza and ceasefire demonstrations are just like the new left. You have occupations that you haven't seen amongst college campuses that really mirror what happened in 1968 and the lead up to the Democratic Convention. And in a way, that's true, but there's also a way in which it's very, very misleading. The demands of these ceasefire protests are noble, but they're actually fairly delimited. They're very specific. They have broad public support in the United States, even amongst a good deal of conservatives. And yet that is not affecting them at all. But we also have to look at the nature of the institutions and surrounding them. As I mentioned earlier, the wealth that the US had proportionately to the rest of the world in the 1960s is just not the case today. Yes, the United States is, ostensibly the richest country in the world, but it does not control 58% of the world's real wealth. 48% of the world's real wealth. The universities were growing massively and quickly in the 1960s. This is a major change post GI Bill. They're shrinking today. The universities have lost a lot of their domestic constituency. They're too expensive. Their diversity quotas have been met largely from universities finding elite students in foreign countries, not by uplifting poor minority students within the U.S., etc. So these institutions are vastly different, and most of these institutions, Columbia and NYU, for example, just to use the biggest ones in the news, they're the largest landlords in New York City. Like, universities today are basically investment firms and property management firms that just happen to teach classes and do a little bit of research when DARPA gives it money. So it's in a very different scenario and context, and yet it looks the same. Because people don't recognize the past, they also don't recognize the difference in conditions in the current. And the ghosts are all they see. So my critique of Fisher has always been, okay, hauntology, yes, things are repeating, but you're not looking at how they're changing because you're so obsessed with the ghost that you're not seeing, because you also don't recognize them as ghosts, for one thing. That's Fisher's accurate about. But you also not looking at the larger context beyond what students are doing and what the left is doing. Even a lot of the critics, the left-wing critics of the American left today, they're not listening to the larger social conditions. They're talking about whatever stupid debate the left is having on Twitter, and who gives a fuck? I mean, sorry, excuse my language, but never mind. My excusing of my language is probably more American. You Kiwis are probably okay with it.
I was gonna say,
But
these are Kiwis here, mate. Don't you worry. I think most of
um,
them.
so so I think in a lot of ways you're kind of stuck in a weird misrecognition and repetition compulsion in the US. Um, and that leads to the way that even the three phases of the new left look like the three phases of the millennial left, and yet every one of them have a completely different context and really represent different things in the larger purview of capitalism, the global system, and American society. And in that way, um, I think we're kind of haunted here. And unfortunately, for most of the Anglophone world, as we go, you catch our diseases. Like, the American left is like the intellectual, ideological STI spreaders of the Anglophone world. And so, and even sometimes in the Europe, don't speak English. And so I'm sorry, but you're probably going to catch it too, even though none of this is your history and it's really removed from you. So it's like double ghosting. So anyway,
Ghosting
that's
squared.
that's my, I mean, it's the irony actually of one of the interesting things about the decline of American global hegemony is weirdly because of the internet and because of media narratives. Um, like the European, British, and oceanic left looks a lot more like us than it did in the past, even though you're not as dependent on us as you were in the past. I'm not sure that you Kiwis were ever that dependent on us, but the British have been. So, here we are.
I think New Zealand definitely is dependent on the United States, at least geopolitically. I'm sure you've sort of seen ramblings around that of late. But
Oh
no,
yeah,
thank you
we're
very much, Derek. Because people may have missed at the start. Derek in Utah, they had daylight savings change, so it is approaching 1 o'clock from him. So we will get to some questions, but we'll try and make them brief.
I'm an
And if
insomniac, so you guys can ask questions. I don't have a problem.
okay, appreciate that. In terms of how to run the question, so I'm going to kick things off, but in terms of the broad sort of approach, you can either put a question in the chat if you're not comfortable putting the mic off and asking directly, and I'll just read them out as they come. But yeah, you put your hands up and I'll just ask you to speak once I see the hand up. But what I want to kick off with, Derek, a partial sort of inspiration for wanting to talk about this with you is because so recently I went to the IMT's, Alan Woods's rebranding of the IMT into the RCP. And I found it quite interesting that at that event, that they essentially have sort of positioned themselves or declared that socialism is dead in the wake of Bernie Sanders and the failure of that movement and in the failure of, especially here with the Jeremy Corbyn movement. And what they sort of seem to be trying to do is erase their history in relation to the Corbyn movement. And they also explicitly said in the event itself that we have polled young kids these days and they all seem to like Lenin. So we want to sort of erase our history of socialism. Now we're rebranding as communist. I don't know if this is like a generational thing or we can call it like an indicator of the death of the millennial left and Zoomers are now communist. It's kind of an interesting sort of position or historical situation we're in for the left, where after the failure of two very, very big movements in the Anglo-American world for an attempt at, a progressive-led high political movement in the wake of that collapse, and then you have a lot of socialist groups who sort of tie themselves to those movements and now wanting to rebrand themselves as communists. I think the YCL here as well, trying to do that. And they're also reigniting a strategy from the new left of the rank and file movement. So just wanted to ask, how well, one, is this similar to the United States? Is that happening there? And
Yeah.
what would you make of that?
Well, I mean, in the United States, the two major anti-revisionist parties, the PSL and the WWP, which are the two outside of the CPUSA orbit, are the RRCP. Oh my God, there's too many RCPs in the world.
Mm,
But RRCP is the Maoist split
that's one, yeah.
from the it's a split removed from the CPUSA, but it's basically Bob Avakian's group.
Mm,
Our weird guru hanging out in France. Um, but the two biggest anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist parties are both Trotsky orient in origin. They're the party. The PSL is a split from the WWP. The WP is the party of Sam Marcy. Sam Marcy was a what you might call a tanky, and I mean this in the formal sense, a person who supported the suppressing of the Hungarian uprising. I don't mean it like in just generic liberals complaining about Stalin. He was a tanky Trotskyist. All right. And the PSL's ideology is pretty much identical to the WWP. The split was about money. And they are the biggest purveyors of anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninism today. They have massive media projects, etc. We have no idea how many people are in it. I'm guessing not more than 6,000. However, they have a lot of money. You might go, how do they have a lot of money? Well, they have very high their dues percentage are percentages of income, and a lot of their central committee are millionaires. So the great irony of American communism is that a lot of American communists' biggest supporters have been bourgeois or just rich, the fail sons of the ultra elite. And so the central committee of the PSL, I counted at least 4 people who are worth at least $3 million net worth. And net worth means we're also subtracting all their debts. So it's an interesting situation to be in the United States. So yes, that's been happening here for a while. The I would say Zoomers, and the America, yeah, they like Lenin. They like Frantz Fanon. They haven't read any of it. They don't know much about it. I mean, they're not very, the oldest ones are 27, the youngest ones are 16. It's um, what they've seen is that the DSA's movement crashed on the rocks of history. They got told to support the Biden administration, and the Biden administration has done nothing for them. All right. But let's also be very careful here, because that would let you to believe that like large portions of people under the age of 27 are Marxist Leninist. They're not. Like large portions of people that of under the age of 27 do not follow politics at all. One of the interesting differences between Zoomers in the United States and millennials is their relative levels of politicization. Now that may change in time. It did with millennials. Millennials were also relatively apolitical when they came of age. But you know, the left in the United States is more identified with the Soviet Union. It's more of like this mythic anti-revisionism, but it's also smaller. Just as a whole, it's significantly smaller. Um, in 2019, there was this Pew poll that everyone still cites. It talks about how socialism have become more popular in the United States amongst people under 40. You know what they don't tell you about, though, is in 2022, that poll was redone, and both socialism and capitalism experienced significant drops in support. Now, that's a little worrying to me. I don't know what the third thing is that you're going to support if you're not a socialist or communist and you're not a capitalist. Usually that, rhymes with ashist, but nonetheless, that seems to be where we are. We've also seen in the United States political polarization amongst young people that's it's been overstated, but it's also pretty much around gender. So women tend to be more left wing. Young men have drifted rightwards during the Biden administration. And then what we've also seen in America is a lot of weird conspiratorial and strange formations from the 80s come back. LaRoucheism, National Bolshevism, just weird shit. Um, so when someone says they're into Lenin, well, which Lenin? Are we talking about
Hmm.
Lenin as read through Alexander Dugin and Limonov? Are we talking about Lenin as read through a bunch of dying Trotskyist sects? Are we talking about Lenin as read through the CPUSA or the Maoist RCP? Which one? I don't know. You don't know either.
Steve
So
Bannon's Lenin.
yeah, Steve Bannon's Lenin. So yeah, Lenin's more popular because um, it looks like successful. It looks like a successful power politics. Um,
Yeah.
and a lot of when you ask a lot of Marxist Leninists what they believe, they were like, "Well, the Soviet Union was a successful revolution." And then I always ask them, "Then why did 1992 happen?" It seems to be the elephant in the room. Um, uh, so we're in a weird moment right now. It's also very hard to tell how big these groups are because they're media um, groups. We don't know how many people are hate watching them. We don't know how many people are bots. We have no idea. Like, so
Derek, that's a convenient segue because there's a question in the chat sort of directed at that from Andrew. He says, we asks, it's a twofold question. If the US left is always repeating the past mistakes, what should it actually be doing? And also, how is the collapse of the public sphere into social media affecting politics in the USA?
oh, that's a huge. I mean, it's affecting it massively, and it's not just affecting the left. What you see all over the United States right now is weird hybrid ideologies that are largely decontextualized and plucked out by individuals. Like I am a paleo conservative Calhounist with socialist tendencies. You know, weird shit like that. That it's a very weirdly atomized liberal consumption view of politics, and it's one that a lot of young people really have. Um, so what should it be doing? I don't think like now when we're talking about the Gaza situation, I think what the students are doing is what they should be doing, to be quite frank. I only pointed out the different historical context because it is different, and we have to look at the um the, the long game is going to be different. And I'm also just going to say kind of an unpopular thing. These student protests will be either recuperated or in the most cases crushed. They will be. That
Mm.
is not a debate. um the question is, what are they going to do afterwards, right? Where are they going to go afterwards? um are they going to try to, I mean, because the big question is, so I have argued if you're going to do electoralism um in the United States, you can't base it off of YouTube views. um you know uh my YouTube views are relatively low, but I'm in the top 10% of podcasts, which is a weird place to be, right? But the top 10% in podcast operates by power law. So like the top 1% are all millionaires, and those of us in the bottom 10% are like, paying our the bottom of that 10% are like being able to pay our filing fees and make a little bit of side gig money. So you know where I'm at.
I was going to say,
But
thanks for covering that because I thought you might have been like a PLA millionaire or something like
no. I'm a teacher. And I can tell you that my podcast money is a third of my teacher salary. So, you can figure that out. Um, the uh One of the things I think we have to say is that they're going to need to build institutions to be resilient, but everything about how you get people interested in politics in the United States right now is anti-institutional. Um, and that's a real contradiction. So a lot of people are going to try to do the rank and file thing. They're going to try to change hearts and minds one person at a time. Good luck with that, right? Um, so I'm not saying that they shouldn't be doing that to some degree, but narrow casting about like-minded people on very low risk, low cost, low investment social media, where like it's literally I'm giving you some of my time to listen to you and maybe a super chat for $5. That is not a high investment politics. That's an entertainment racket. And that's something you have to really think about. So while political education is good and social media and YouTube enables us to do it in a much more facilitated fashion, we should never confuse that with it being a successful political movement, particularly when the stats can be gamed so easily. So there's that. So the other thing we should be doing is, in the United States, we're also in a weird period in regard to labor. You hear about labor all the time. You hear about new unions all the time, but union density in the United States is still declining. Still declining. It's yes. There's, I think, technically there was a slight uptick in union membership, but compared to the growth in the workforce, it's declined. All right. Weirdly, the high point of union growth in terms of density in the United States after the 9/11 was actually from 2011 to 2012. It's not now. All right. So we should be trying to figure out why that is and how to help these unions get off the ground. A lot of these new unions, like you hear about their victories, like you heard about Amazon, the Amazon distribution center in New York unionizing. Yeah, it still doesn't have a contract. And they're basically waiting it out. And it's becoming like it's actually beginning to fracture within its own ranks. I hear from people internally because they don't know what to do being stalled out. So, yeah, I think that is. But we should be focusing on labor. And we should be focusing on the ceasefire in Gaza. And I have the controversial view that we should be focusing on punishing the Democrats. And I really mean that. Like, we should be punishing them. Because in the United States, for the entirety of the 20th century, really, the left has been captive to the Democratic Party. They will not actually totally punish them or break from them. The only time where they tried was Debs during the Woodrow Wilson period. All right. Every other time, the left has immediately conciliated to the Democratic Party, or been small micro sects outside of it that had no real power. I know what's going to happen if the left tries to punish the Biden administration. We're going to be blamed for a Trump administration. It's not our fault. I mean, my answer to that's always been, well, if you really thought that fascists were so important, maybe you should have not sucked so bad. But, nonetheless, that's an unpopular opinion in a lot of cases. So we do need to, in the DSA, the more radical factions talk about holding our electeds accountable. Now, I don't think the DSA can really do that, even though it's fairly large. It doesn't have the money to really do that. But we can spread propaganda and fuck up a vote, which is a grand Marxist tradition going back to the original stance of the Second International and the SPD, is if you're going to engage in electoralism, is to fuck up your enemies, not really to push some agenda. And I think that's what we should be doing right now. Now, the reason why we're doing that is not because, revenge or anything petty like that. It's actually so that we can prove that we can stand independently of the Democratic Party and not be captured to it. And if we can't do that, we're gonna go through another cycle of the same thing.
Who's got some questions? Either put them in the chat, put your hand up, turn your mic off.
I think there's two I've seen pop up.
Two?
Oh, no, one's a statement.
Yeah.
I got a question.
Go on, Michael.
Can you hear me all right? I'm actually driving in my car at work, so it's kind of a funny situation to be thinking of the question. But I thought I'd seize the moment since Varn brought up the really interesting point about the Democrats, which was raised earlier in the discussion. And what I'm interested to hear more about is this emphasis on hauntology, and I assume the that's coming from Derrida, because Derrida was quoted in the intro, the event summary, rather than the kind of Fisherite reading of Derrida. And when I say that, what I mean is that you really emphasize the evacuation of content from the past. So when we inherit the kind of ideological problems, the catchphrases, the thought-terminating cliches of the 60s generation, for instance, but also before that, going back to the old left, going back to the late 19th century, what we're really doing is we're taking it up and we're grappling with it and trying to put the shoe on, but it doesn't fit, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
now,
correct.
When I hear that, what I'm basically thinking of is historical regression. And this, I know, isn't an esoteric point for you, because you used to be a member of Platypus. I'm a current member of Platypus, as well as being a member of the Federation. And the understanding that I take from Marx with regards to historical regression is such that repetition has a certain meaning to it. And even under degraded conditions, when we put that old shoe on from the past, we're doing it because we're doing it for a certain reason. Like, there is a problem that we are still trying to solve.
Correct.
And I want to understand from your perspective what you think that problem might be, and why, and what the Democrats have to do with it, and maybe what you see in hauntology. What value does hauntology offer to this kind of conundrum?
So for me, the problem that is essentially arised in the United States is that our electoral system is locked into a party sorting mechanism that was developed ad hoc in the 19th century, that really makes class coalitions easy, but class independent movements very hard. Now, it's hard everywhere. It's not just hard in the United States, but the United States is under particular conditions. When you try to import any classical communist strategy, all right, United Front from above, United Front from below, Popular Front, etc., you run into the fact that we're not a parliamentary system. Those strategies were designed for a parliamentary system. So that's the tactical question that's being repeated, but there's also a distinct and deeper question that's being repeated. How do you get a highly fractious working class? And I mean highly fractious, it's not just divided amongst the obvious things like race, gender, etc. It's also divided by region, section, industry sectors, interest of industry sectors. It's those industry sectors related to different aspects of the political economy, the different relationships to the military, the different relationships to certain forms of currency. How do you get a class independent movement to move from the class in itself to the class for itself? And how do you do that autonomously without creating a sense of state dependency? If we go back to Lenin and we go back to Lenin's State and Revolution, Lenin agrees with Pannekoek that the state is inherently a class organ. There are sometimes where the competition between the bourgeoisie will make the state more independent seeming, and this tends to happen in times of crises of order, both economic and political. So the state can seem stronger in those time periods. They're actually they can seem stronger, but the reality is, like, you read the Brumaire, for example, the state's actually weaker, and so this appearance of authority kind of comes up. And in some ways, I think a key question that's come out of Platypus since I left it, this was not a discussion question when I was in it, but it is one now. And I think it's a smart question, is why we can't figure out what to do with imperialism or Bonapartism without replicating imperialism or Bonapartism somewhere else in some other part of the world or some other part of the system. And that's something that's also not been addressed. So yes, I would agree with you, Michael, that there's a fundamental problem that hasn't been solved. The quote in the Vermeer that we might talk about, I like to kind of put it into common slang, is we all LARP until we don't. All right. We always complain about leftist LARPing, but in reality, Marx describes the way left movements work. They're always they always emerge in the clothing of another time. It's because that's where your models come from. It is only when you actually start to have power do you emerge as something completely new. And that is, to give Platypus a little bit of credit here. I mean, people might know about my disagreements with Platypus. My interpretations of the bourgeois revolution are a little different than theirs, but they're fundamentally right that if you had a socialist left in America that was worth a shit, it wouldn't be recognizable to anything in the past at all. Like, because it would come out of current conditions. And so, in a deeper sense, Fisher's reading of Hauntology, Derrida's reading of Hauntology, is like beginning to see the problems of decadence and regression and political subjects, but putting it in aesthetic terms around cultural memory, our history, etc. And it feels the always already-ness of it all, right? But that's a misrecognition in a way of a deeper political economic concern. And Derrida, being effectively a post-structuralist and a post-Marxist, even though he was like, oh well, we still need the stuff that Marx was talking about, but the fundamental questions of Marxism for Derrida were solved. The Platypus answer is like, no, they weren't. Like they weren't solved at all. And so I think there's a certain amount of usefulness in looking at that. But that's my answer to that question. Tom?
Sorry, just finding the unmute button. Thanks for the talk, Derek. It was really, really interesting. I guess I was sort of thinking I like your rewording of the quote from the Premier there. But one thing that I sort of wonder about when we're talking about the generational differences with Zoomers coming up now, and they're sort of more unproblematic in their own minds anyway, attachment to like the imagery and aesthetics and supposedly politics of like, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. There's been a group in this country not very long ago at all that has, at their founding conference had portraits of Stalin and Mao on the wall and things like this. It's quite incredible to me, but nonetheless, they even like the McDonald's color schemes, which I've always found really horrible, and that sort of political stuff. But I do wonder if part of that is like, it seems like there's a slight generational difference as far as like there's interesting and crippling self-consciousness of millennials, where we worry quite a lot about LARPing and talk quite a lot about LARPing and don't want to be seen to be doing that. But it can create this like, this sort of problem of like always wanting plenty of ironic distance and never really wanting to commit to anything too much in case you seem too much like you mean it. It's not, it's not quite as bad as the Gen X cynicism depicted well in that episode of The Simpsons, but it does have the it's one thing I wonder about, and I wonder if you had any thoughts around that. Like, to what degree is the LARPing a problem, and to what degree is actually the inability to just confidently and specifically align oneself with politics in the sort of millennial socialist left part of why it seems to have gone down not particularly fruitful route so far?
Well, I think we can. I think the millennial left is haunted itself by the fact that it comes out of a very specific milieu. And that specific milieu, when it came up, is a world without the Soviet Union, where China, particularly in the 90s, seemed particularly neoliberal in its orientation. yeah, and where it felt like yeah, there was a few socialist societies in the world, maybe Norway, maybe the DPRK, vastly different societies, I may add. But for the vast majority, the 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 socialist past was over, and we had to bring it back. For Zoomers, in a lot of ways, they want a clear political vision. I think what they're actually doing is more Sorelian than even Marxist Leninist, and that they are propagating a myth that's an inversion of another myth. I mean, like, they're responding to realizing how much bullshit anti-communism is, but their response to that is to believe everything Grover Furr says, which is, kind of objectively a disaster. The But they want something, and they want to dig into it. I'm going to say something in the United States. I'm not willing to say that this is true for Zoomers in New Zealand. I'm not even sure the generational patterns are as important outside of the United States, because that thing I said about wealth really being the thing that makes the generational differences matter. Although I bet home ownership problems actually does kind of rhyme. The Zoomers have a lot less prospects than even the millennials thought they had. Like, Zoomers, by and large, and I'm not just talking about leftists here, are fairly nihilistic about the future. They just are. Like, and they have good reason to be. I mean, think about what they've gone through. COVID. They watched the Bernie stuff fail. They have seen, in the United States, they've seen all the political compass seemingly lose their narratives completely right in front of them. Their social institutions are even in the quote richest country in the world completely falling apart. I mean, we have bridges fucking falling down. Like, yeah, like, we can't get our political system to, even though we have this massive and hugely expensive administrative state. One of the really big misrecognitions of the millennial left was the nature of neoliberalism. They all thought and talked about it as if it made the state smaller and a bigger state was good. The state grew in the neoliberal period compared to the Fordist period or the social democratic period. All right. It eats up more GDP. It's more invested in the economy in a direct sense. It just doesn't give a shit about workers anymore. And one of the ironies of this, and I don't think most Zoomers understand this, but they intuit it, is that the Fordist New Deal coalition left actually created the public-private partnerships that made neoliberalism possible. And they feel, I say feel, I don't think they understand this, that the whole, like, well, if neoliberalism was about the shrinking of the state, why didn't the state shrink at all? Why is there still this massive state apparatus? Why there's all these more cops, there's more military, there's more everything. And yet nothing works. I mean, it very much feels, sometimes I say it like, for a society that objectively, like just geographically speaking, the United States should be very well positioned for even decoupling and post neoliberalism and all that stuff. Like, we are a resource-rich country with a lot of food land and still a fair amount of water, although our cities are on the wrong places, but we still have the water. We have a relatively strong defense system. We have good relationships with both our neighbors. I mean, good relationships with both our neighbors, as in we boss them around. Objectively speaking, we should not be the basket case that we are, but we are. And that whole generation beneath us, right, left, center, they all feel it. Right? And they feel the need to attach to something that the millennials couldn't do. But I do sometimes worry that we think about this, there's two dangers for me. Political determinism, which is thinking that, like, basically, it's what I accuse David Graeber of, ironically, that, like, if you build it, they will come because you think it is so, right? If we think right thoughts, we can build another future. And I'm like, well, you got to be able to actually build and maintain that future more than just think it. Like, and you have to look at the conditions that led to it. And the conditions, yes, ideology or vision or meta humans, as he would talk about it, they all contribute to those conditions, but none of them themselves are the condition. Like, you have to look at all of it. And so sometimes I think we see this too much in an idea of just individual generational psychology. The Zoomers are more nihilistic because they realistically perceive that there's not, it's not that the future has even been canceled. It's just completely fucking falling apart. There's a future, it just blows. And no one's built any alternative to it, including the people who run everything. And so, yeah, when you deal with that, more radical ideologies seem possible. And we saw that in the millennial period too. We just didn't see it amongst the millennial left. We saw it amongst the millennial right, where you saw a fragmentation of the old traditional right, a reassertance of things from the past, which from a conservative position is even easier to do because they're not promising shit about the future, other than it'll be like the past. So you saw this in all kinds of forms during on the right. The right in the United States, despite the fact it's probably going to win the next election, probably might lose the House, probably going to get the Senate, almost statistically certainly going to get the Senate. And I'm now putting slight money that even if Trump's in prison, he might still win. Biden's even losing center progressives on a majority of stuff, and the economic news in the last month has not been great for anybody. Worldwide, we're seeing a spate of business bankruptcies really beginning to kick in. So that, recession that everyone's been talking about us starving off, well, we postponed it. So who knows what's going to happen. And unlike, and I'm not a Grossmanite. I don't think like, oh, the capitalist crisis is going to do all the work for us. But unlike 2007, 2008, China is not ascendant to also pick up the slack. China's GDP is roughly moving like ours. There's been a pivot to industrial policy, but there's all kinds of tariff walls going up all over the place for them. So it's hard to see where this was going. And so, like with Zoomers, you in the United States, you saw this real big identification with China and Chinese socialism. That's already going away. Like that element of it is dying, and you see stuff like Midwestern Marx, etc., and they're growing. I have no idea how organic their growth is or not. I suspect it's fairly, though. They're interesting people. And they present a pretty compelling but mythic politics. It's their politics is patriotic socialism light, detente with all existing socialist countries, and the Sino-Soviet split never happened, but if it did happen, the Chinese were right. Like, that's their. I mean, like, I read the Derrida book, and it talks about the Western left and people accusing each other of being capitalist roaders, and like doesn't mention the Sino-Soviet split ever, except they accuse Khrushchev of historical nihilism. Like, you're like, well, you need to support both Cambodia and Vietnam. I'm like, you can't. You literally can't. So that's very popular amongst Zoomers. It's a very easy narrative to take, but it is essentially mythic, and it's essentially a media myth too. I have not seen it translate to anything, and the levels of mediation and alienation among Zoomers is actually kind of hard to understand, for me anyway. I mean, some of you Zoomers can be like, it's not hard to understand, Varn. I live with it. But like the levels of, I've never dated. I only have 2 friends and stuff that come up on American surveys. I don't go sports. I don't go outside. Talking to anybody gives me massive anxiety. Is huge. And another interesting thing about Zoomers that's very interesting, and they got this from the millennial left in a way, is as like stupid music subculture started dying because of the homogenization of the internet, what did Zoomers try on as identities? Well, like I was literally watching, I was listening to my Justin Centrilla, who did a role playing game on political ideologies. He did like a study of a bunch of Zoomers who came up during who were like 12 and 13 during the end of Tumblr, and was like, yeah, they would like be multiple people on the internet with completely separate ideologies that they were like trying on and literally like putting on. And the irony is like, well, the while the millennial left was concerned about LARPing, the Zoomer left was literally massive online role playing a bunch of different positions at the same time to figure out what they were. Um, Starting with anarchism and working through, you know, a bunch of different ideologies. Um, I think that's still to some degree true, and I don't think that's just on the left. I like, you know, the amount of flavors of conservatism in the United States now has massively increased. It used to be like paleo conservative and neoconservative, and the neoconservatives were the Reagan coalition, and paleo conservatives were the Pat Buchanan losers and weird, ill-fitting Brooks Brothers suits. And today, there's national conservative, tradcaf conservatism, integralism, neo-reactionaryism. You just got so much you can pick from because it's largely atomized and it's a largely media-mediated sphere. And again, in that way, the right wing was actually ahead of the left because they hit that before we did. And you know, there was a freak out about it, and you know, that's over now. So it's hard to see where things are going to go.
When you said Trump might run from prison, I just had this immediate thought of, you know, waiting for Chris Crotone to write, Trump's the new Debs.
Oh,
That's going to come.
I'm almost certain that's gonna come. Why not? Why not? Why not Trump again? I think he's already written that article, actually.
Yeah, he's already written that, but he'll write something like Debs is the new, or Trump is the new Debs. I'm sure of it. But is there any other questions out there, friends, neighbors?
Two I see in the chat. Where New Zealand is trying to follow the U.S., what would you say is the most important thing to avoid? Dear God, don't pick up our identity frameworks, because our identity frameworks are only for. Yeah. Oh God, you're so fucked. Um. Can you discuss identity politics and deplatforming a bit more? You know what? I have been worried about one very specific thing, and we're seeing this now in the Gaza stuff. The ties to the security apparatus that a lot of the left signed, a lot of the millennial left signed on to from fear of Trumpism to kind of come down on, you know, the quote alt-right, etc., is really being used on these student protesters today. And there's very little you can do about it. And so you have people who are supporting canceling people in major universities just 2 years ago, talking about the absolute need for freedom of expression and academic freedom today because they're getting their asses kicked. Unfortunately, that's going to put the left in a really weird position, and including the Zoomer left, because it's hard to understand how the resistance liberal popular front's going to come back and face that when you're also talking about like what the Biden administration is doing. I do think that the Gaza situation has cut through this, but it's cut through this in a way that I don't know is gonna last, because one way or the other, the Gaza situation is going to end. Like you know, it might end with Israel claiming the West Bank, cutting off a third of the Gaza territory and letting some kind of super dependent, technically independent RUP state exist in Gaza. That's not the worst outcome. I mean, the worst outcome is they just ethnically cleanse it, but it will end. You will see, I think we're going to see some actual successes at more liberal universities on divestment in places where it can be. And so one of the benefits of that and why it has cut through it is Gaza has very clear conditions. And it's one of the things I've been really puzzling about lately is like, okay, during BLM, people were demanding stuff that there was no way the state could have done. All right. And they didn't, I mean, they freaked out about it eventually. Like, yeah, you started seeing cops like throwing tear gas in rich neighborhoods, not caring about bystanders in a way you had not traditionally seen. But it took a little while. It really did take a little while. I mean, specifically considering like they literally burned down a police precinct. It's surprising how long it took for them to get all crushy about it. The private school administrations who were initially supportive of this of the students and turned against them pretty quickly, when people started digging up their plagiarism stuff and whatnot, they all turned heel pretty quickly on these. And I've seen police brutality on these student protests that you only saw towards the end of BLM, are during like the Rodney King riots and stuff. I mean, it's been pretty brutal. No one's been killed yet, I think, but it's been pretty brutal. And I find that interesting because also like just if you know anything about the US academic calendar, all these students are about to have to go home anyway. Like, and I can't tell if our bourgeois elites are just stupid. I mean, like, seriously? If they've regressed that much? Because the one thing I can tell you is popular opinion in the United States on Gaza is pro-Gaza by a slim majority for the first time in my lifetime. All right. But it has no effect, like none, on what the parties are doing. Like none at all. And it's really making it obvious that in both parties, popular opinion does not have a whole lot of sway at all. Like, and I mean, they're not just crushing this, they're kind of doubling down on it. Schumer and what's his face, the Republican guy, we've gone through so many Republican speakers of the House. It's almost like, I don't know, prime ministers in Great Britain, that I can't keep up with his name, but they're talking about inviting Netanyahu to speak to Congress in lieu of all this. They passed laws that are blatantly against our First Amendment. This anti-Semitism curtailing law, it might be found constitutional because their Supreme Court's basically a dictatorship that runs everything now, since our legislature can't do anything other than shit like this. Ban TikTok and declare that protesting Israel is anti-Semitism and it's probably a hate crime now. But it hasn't gotten through the Senate yet, but it probably will. And you're seeing also I was reading that the Biden administration is activating DHS, Department of Homeland Security, to throw a lot of the leaders of these movements, like they're going to hit them with probably insurgency charges and shit. So we're going to see anti-terror laws, some of which leftists supported to be used on January 6ers, being used on leftists themselves. So if you want to ask me if there's one thing you guys shouldn't do in New Zealand, don't be opportunists like that. It comes back on you hard. Like, so that's
that. We may have beat you to the punch because we had. Did you see much about the occupation of our Parliament lawns like 2 years ago?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so we had leftists at the time basically supporting state forces to come in and completely remove them, and also charge a lot of the people, a lot of the leaders, with particular, I don't think it was anti-terrorism laws, but charge them for whatever they could slap against them. And there was a few of us even in the Fed who were sort of like, we shouldn't be supporting this at all. That's not like, it will come back around to bite us. And I don't know what will be our version of the left having that bite being bitten.
Well, but, yeah. It's one thing to be cynically opportunist when you have power. It's another thing to be cynically opportunist when you think you have power, but someone else has power and you misrecognize that as your power. Which I would still advise, even when you do have power, not being cynically opportunist, but it is kind of a different scenario. One of the great, someone asked me about deplatforming. One of the great misrecognitions of deplatforming is that the left in the United States has a schizophrenic idea about whether or not it has power. Like, they say they don't have any power, but then they try to deplatform shit as if they control the cultural sphere entirely. You know, they try to do like Smithian friend enemy distinctions. If you're not actually the sovereign, man, even if you read Smith, which by the way, fascist jurists probably shouldn't do what he says anyway. But but beyond that, if you're not the sovereign, you don't have that power. It's not going to work out for you. Like, so even from the most cynical point of view, that was stupid and it was misrecognition. And we're going to see a lot of these protest leaders pay for it. And again, I don't think it's going to end the protests in the United States. I have no idea where this is going to go. The thing is, though, I can very much see there is likely to be a Red Scare again in America, and I think it might be led by the Democrats as much more so than the Republicans because of they're going to blame us for Biden losing instead of, you know, them sucking, which objectively they did. I mean, they didn't achieve hardly anything they promised. So there's that. That's going to be fun. And it might be bipartisan. I mean, the one thing I will tell you that's kind of shocking is supposedly our hyper divided government, which can't do anything, can ban TikTok and pass weird speech code laws all of a sudden when it can't even agree on a fucking budget. So there you go. Like, that shows you what they think is important. But I'm going to say something somewhat controversial. I don't really know why they care so much, because protests in the United States historically don't work. So like, I'm sort of like, what are they afraid of? And I think they're afraid of not the protests themselves, but what happens after it. And that's the big thing that we always have to ask ourselves. What are the two steps beyond this? What happens when this Gaza situation is settled one way or the other? Like that, when I tell people are like, oh, we can use the Gaza situation to revitalize the left, I'm like, yeah, but that's one thing. And it's very easy to have a clear vision on one thing. We can have all kinds of people in the you know, the Israeli ceasefire coalition, including conservatives, but that doesn't translate to communism. Now, I'm not an ultra leftist who says because it doesn't translate to communism, we shouldn't do it, because I'm like, well, I don't want 1 million Palestinians dying of starvation. That's not on my world historic things I want to see fucking happen. So no, we do have to fight this. We do have to help them as best as we can. But on the same token, like, let's be real here. This does not actually really, it's not something you can constitute a long-term left around. This is not even clearly a peace movement. This is clearly a ceasefire in this specific instance with very specific goals movement. And on one hand, it's nice to have people having clear goals again, like pat on them for that. On the other hand, though, it's like, okay, but I was listening to Chapo, and one of the leaders at Columbia was like, and we're going to take this and fight settler colonialism as Columbia tries to expand their ownership into Harlem. And I'm like, okay, like, so Harlem is an occupied territory of which a private university is acting as a settler colonial power to, although that's all in the same country, all this same citizenship group, and they have the same rights to ownership now. Seems like you're misapplying settler thought. But you know, I can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to pivot this to a larger problem, because it is a problem how much of these huge landlords these universities have become. But instead of just saying that, they have to like talk about it in terms of settlerism and mention Jacques words and stuff like that. Jacques being the author of Settlers, a very unfortunate book.
Yeah, we see a little bit of that. It's perhaps not quite as tenuous, because there are some interesting arguments around like various natural gas and other resources being competed over Gaza, but there's a lot of younger climate groups that are talking a lot about how Palestine is a climate issue, and it's that ongoing tendency of the left to be like everything is everything else. And I don't think that's what's meant when we're meant to be trying to figure out like a expansive and clear program or platform for the left. It's not meant to be that everything is actually can be just equated to everything else. Like it's just one big circle. There's not even a Venn diagram. It's just one thing. And it's a really tedious tendency, I think, on the left, and it's really not very convincing. I think for me,
No.
anyway. Yeah.
No, I don't think it is either. Angus, I think. Maybe not.
Is there a hand up? Is there?
No, I saw on.
Sorry, I unmuted by accident, so I edit that out later.
Okay.
Yeah, hey, Derek, the problem of like how to relate to the states to the state seems to be like something that's going to become more difficult. Like I think about like say you were talking before about the anti-vax protests, but then also we had the 2001 terrorist attacks, and then like in reaction the Labour Party supported the invasion of Afghanistan. The Alliance Party split over it, which was a left social democratic party. And then the anti-terror laws that were passed were used on Maori and leftists in 2007. Introduced by Labour, used it in another Labour government, or same Labour government actually. And then more recently we had the Christchurch mosque shootings.
Mm-hmm.
And like, because it's a far right guy, like you're like, well, good for Jacinda. She's like, like rally round the Labour Party against barbaric tendencies in politics. Whereas what you're saying, and probably quite rightly, like, what you are supporting, hoping that it'll be used against the right, is going to be used against you. However, if there's barbaric tendencies are rising in politics, like how do you resist that temptation? What does it look like, etc.?
A militia. I used to say I take the DSA seriously when they institute their own militia. Like, which I don't know that you can easily do that in New Zealand. I mean, you're not, nor do I want you to be crawling with guns like we are. We have more guns than people. We've had more guns with people for like we've had more guns than people than the 60s. Actually, now we have a lot more guns than people. But which and I do like to bring up the fact that like, okay, you have a AR-15, but it's not going to do you much against a cluster bomb, dude. At the same token, like the idea that we're going to just have the state do our work for us because it's easy or convenient is a pretty bad idea. We don't control the state. We don't have a lot of influence in the state even. In the United States, I mean, my working thesis is the military is the only thing holding our country together. So, the state is literally a kind of let me put it this way. Liberals often miss that the administrative state and the military are basically the same thing in the United States. And that's not obvious to people. But that means whenever you're empowering them, you're empowering, the very imperialist force that you're trying to fight. And so that's a very weird move. But I don't think it's an easy answer. I mean, because the one thing I would say is like, yeah, of course, like that Christchurch guy, like you guys should throw the book at him. And I mean, I'm frankly sad he got caught and you didn't just, beat him to death. But I'm not advocating beating people to death on a public platform, but I sort of think you have to do like if you hand over all your ideas of force to the state that has the force, you're also handing it over to the people who control that state, and that's not you. So I might feel slightly different about it if it was a more left-wing state. But on this instance, I'm kind of sympathetic with the Platypus Affiliated Society. We have to be really careful with that stuff because it is in the United States in particular. It does get used against far rightists a lot. It does, but it more often than not gets used by leftists, and no one even hears about it when it gets used on leftists. Like like rightists don't shut the fuck up when it happens, and so like you hear about it all the time. Whereas when a bunch of leftist anarchists or a political group, you know, gets thrown into the clinker, it doesn't help that every now and then they deserve it. See like the Black Hammer Society, which has got bodies behind it. But for the most part, those people are like, you barely know them. You find out about them later. They're like, you read about it in a history book after they've been in prison for 20 years. Like, and that's a real big problem, to put it mildly. I think one of the things about the millennial left is that it was utterly incoherent in the United States about how it should respond to state violence and state power. Like, I mean, we were literally celebrating using using anti-terror laws to come down on Jan 6ers while also talking about abolishing the police. What? And when you would point out that this was an obvious impossibility, people would just mock you or call you a right winger. And I'm like, but you can't do both. You literally cannot do both. Like, so yeah, anyway.
Yeah, that's a really interesting sort of line of conversation, because I think for one thing, Andrew, you know, how can a left-wing movement organize against possible rising barbarism in politics is a good question, and the answers do kind of exist, and I kind of agree with what Derrick suggested, and I also tend to think through building institutions, you just hopefully become a cultural and political force that people come to instead of going down these other things. And that's one area where I tend to be unwilling to take on the criticism that sometimes this Federation of Social Societies can be a bit filled with younger white men who might be a bit grumpy. It's like, fuck, they're better here than somewhere else. So yeah, but the other thing with the terror attack, it's like, how do you organize against a lone gunman? You don't really. Like that specific scenario, there wasn't really a great political answer to it, I don't think. That would have made very much sense. And then the stuff that's flowed on from that has just been around how to better censor the internet and how to shore up some hate speech legislation. And just recently this week, Facebook showed me a memory where I had only learned quite recently that whole, you know, the hate speech legislation argument where people say you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre actually comes from 1919, a Supreme Court decision against the government, because they tried to use that to say that their suppression of socialists who were opposing World War I was legitimate. Because so that phrase that's used to try and justify bringing in hate speech legislation came up. It was a defense used by the government to back the suppression of socialists, and they didn't even win the case. So it's massively misused now. But again,
it had something to do with UG Debs, didn't it?
Yes,
something like that, yeah. But even now, if you come out saying, you know, I don't actually support hate speech legislation, I don't like hate speech, but I don't support the legislation, you do still get called a right winger. You get called all sorts of things. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I will say this as a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist and somewhat skeptic of the U.S. Constitution. I think our First Amendment is actually pretty smart. So like, we just don't give a fuck about it. My thing is that unfortunately in the United States history, we never really have, like, you know, one of the first acts that we do during you know, the lead up to what was maybe a war with France, ended up being a war with France, ended up actually being a war with Britain, but in the lead up to the War of 1812 was the Alien and Sedition Act, which were speech suppressions that were pretty blatantly unconstitutional, but no one gave a shit. And so that's the long history of us. Is we, you know, the sanctity of the Constitution has more been proven in its violation, but every now and then the Supreme Court will actually be principled. It's hard to guess though, because who knows what our Supreme Court is going to do at any given time. They're, you know, 9 people that really can override almost any governmental decision in the country, and they sit for life. So, yeah, I mean, far be it from me to question the wisdom of our founding fathers, but maybe that was not a great idea. But yeah, I do think it's actually quite interesting on free speech or hate speech or whatever. I don't know. I'm with you, Tom, on institution buildings. I was actually gonna maybe add that like good institutions and an attractive program in a social movement with strong mediation and ties and binds uh usually mitigates the need for violence, at least for the most part. It reduces zero-sum competition, particularly when you're not doing stupid things like leftists have historically done, like faction bans and stuff. But you do have to be able to deal with violence, and that's something we have to really deal with. What is a Black Hammer Society? The Black Hammer Society. They were what I thought was an internet cult, but is not. I actually met their undersecretary here in Salt Lake City, which is bizarre. Was weirdly involved with them. They destroyed three socialist activist groups. They really doubled down on how Jews were white people, and killing Anne Frank was okay. And maybe socialists needed to get to be with the Proud Boys. And there's no such thing. They're also Jace Kai's. There's no such thing as a good white leftist. They got caught up in their founder like bought a house in Atlanta, and was charged with aggravated sodomy, manslaughter. There's at least one person dead, maybe two. Then they got hit after that with taking FSB funds, so Russian intelligence agency funds, with a couple other groups. Another one called the Uhuru Movement, which Black Hammer was a split off of, which is like a split of a split of a split of a split of a split from the Black Panthers. And the other one was actually a far right wing movement. So, and it looks like they were legitimately taking Russian money. I'm not, I'm not here to defend the practice. I don't think it's a great practice to go after people for that sort of thing, but I don't think the charges are completely trumped up. It may be a bullshit law, but it is within the purview of the law. Anyway.
Derek, I am concerned it is now 2 a.m. for you.
It is. I am getting tired and rambly, so.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think we can wrap things up there, but in the interest of the Fed again, in terms of talking about LARPing, I didn't talk about our Commonweal, which is our twice annual newsletter, in the affectation of William Morris and the Socialist League. So that's something we do, like I said, twice a year. It's I will try and find a way to get some sent to you, as a thank you for your generous time with us today. But yeah, like I said, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for coming to this. We'll be up on YouTube, so please do share it around, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your school term. Derek, you said you got a month to go, so I'm sure you're looking forward to the holidays.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Derek. See you, everyone.
See you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, guys.